Welcome to the Double Loop Podcast, your source for everything about fingerprints. While you're working on your comparisons, we'll talk about comparisons. So what's up with all you wacky and weird Whirl watchers? I'm Eric Ray.
And I'm Glenn Langenberg.
So welcome back. We're back to our regular sound now that it's just Glenn and I. We've got a lot of stuff to get to this episode, especially later on. We'll do a little conversation about a new article that's coming out here very soon from Simon Cole. But first, I think we need to get a couple updates from Glenn. You have some stuff to talk about. Your finger, I'm assuming, is healing. Your eyes, hopefully, getting better and improving.
Oh yeah, definitely on the mend on those. You want me to talk about that, or do you got anything?
Oh yeah,
else?
Please.
All right. I just thought you maybe want to tell the listeners about the awesome weather that you're having. That you're at 80 degrees, and the rest of the country is freezing their bells off.
Well, a year from now, the Super Bowl will be in just down the street in Glendale, Arizona, and for like 3 weeks now, it's been like 80 degrees, sunny. I know it sounds terrible but it's actually kind of getting tired of it. We kind of want it just to get cloudy and rain and be cold for a little bit before we have to go back to crazy heat all summer long.
That's true. In a few months, I'll be laughing at you when you're at 150 degrees and we're at a nice 75.
Exactly.
But you invested all in the Super Bowl. For the listeners, this is the night before the Super Bowl, so I always do a little Super Bowl party, and I'm getting my chili and meatballs and other stuff together for the little shindig tomorrow. What about you guys? You guys do anything?
Oh, the kids and I went to the store. We picked out treats for to have during the Super Bowl, so everyone's got something that they really like, and so it'll just be a family thing for us. But you know what? Through the magic of editing, we can actually, even though we're recording on Saturday, the night before the Super Bowl, we'll broadcast this on Tuesday. So let's quick throw in a congratulations to the
Pittsburgh Steelers.
Unfortunately, I don't think that's going to happen this year. But congratulations to the Seattle Seahawks for your win in the Super Bowl this year. Congratulations to the Seattle Seahawks, because that's where I'm from. So go Seahawks.
Is that who you're rooting for, Seahawks?
Actually, I'm rooting for the Denver Broncos.
I am too, actually. Just because I'm a hater. Excellent. Okay. Well, I have a few updates. I received some emails here and there and texts from people over the last, a couple of weeks asking about the eyes and finger. So I'll just kind of lump some of those together. The finger, basically exactly a month ago. It's been exactly 1 month that I injured the finger, and it's cool because the what we know about the biological formation of skin and the regenerative growth of skin and so forth is right on point. It's been exactly 1 month, and it's pretty much healed over. Full epidermal layer coming in. Friction ridges have grown back. It looks like scars forming just near the tip, but it's not so bad. I was surprised at how much epidermis has really grown around what I thought was, maybe dermis that might have been removed. So as it's growing in, it feels thinner in that area, and it's a bit numb, and the skin feels very stretched. I mean, it feels like, compared to the rest of the finger, it feels like there's not much skin protecting me, before you get to, blood and other tissue. But I mean, it's grown in pretty nicely. I was kind of surprised to see that you can't really tell. You can't tell that much. It's filled in, and it just has grown at a fairly amazing rate. It's kind of incredible.
It always does amaze me when to just observe that healing process. And I've had my share of cuts and scratches and torn up skin, and you get for a little while that just tenderness that eventually just goes away too. And I don't know if I've quite lost that much real estate before, but I'm sure it'll grow in and eventually feel almost completely normal. Have you been taking any kind of inking as it heals, as it goes along?
No, I didn't. Honestly, I didn't want to get ink on it because it was just painful for a while, and I didn't really want to get any ink up in there, and it was just painful to the touch and so forth. So I didn't take
Not
any
even
inking.
for science?
Yeah, I was being a wuss. But in
Oh,
the
it's
end, I don't know that the friction ridges are going to have changed all that much. Again, because of the angle I caught it at, I think I caught a lot of epidermis. So
oh, okay.
I I don't know that it's going to look all that different. I can see the one area where I really got a big chunk of meat that was right at the tip of the finger, but I don't know that there were a lot of ridges right next to the nail to really worry about.
Yeah, no, I know what you mean. Interesting. Huh?
Yeah.
We'll
And as
keep.
for the eyes, I had a couple of people ask about the LASIK surgery. I guess some people were either thinking about it at the end of last year or went on a medical savings plan through their work for this year, who are considering getting it done. And yeah, again, all I can say is I just love it. It was one of the best decisions I made, and I just wish I had done it sooner in life. But by taking we did this Pelly chart, Pelli Pelly chart, where we looked at the contrast differences,
Yeah,
and right. So there was this chart of I don't know what it was, 60 letters, ranging from pure black on white all the way to almost quite, not quite white on white, but it was just subtle enough you might be able to see the contrast. So it was this nice contrasted chart that went through, I don't know, 60 shades of, grayscale or whatever.
right.
And I think it was essentially all the way to the last row with the last 6 letters. I could easily read the first 3 and could just make out the last 3 before the eye surgery. And then afterwards, the week after when we did the podcast, I couldn't make out the last 3 of the 6. So it was like I lost 3 off the chart. And now I can kind of get 2 of them. So I still have that last one that I can't quite get, that a lot of people struggle with to get anyway. But so
Exactly. I always struggle with that one too.
yeah, it's not perfect, and they did say that it will be 3 to 6 months as your eyes are still really adjusting, to and learning how to refocus and that, and there were some moments where I had difficulty focusing up on close objects if I was doing precision things. If I was trying to pick something up or I was trying to screw some screws into holes, I had a hard time like getting my eyes to focus on the hole. But again, that was just the first few weeks. My eyes don't have any problem with that now. And I put a magnifier on some prints the other day and had no problem looking through the magnifier. No problem seeing detail. So again, from a latent print examiner standpoint, I feel like I could easily do my job either through a magnifier and certainly on screen.
Yeah, and I wish I would have thought of this before. You'd gone through the surgery, but I almost want to see one of those Pelly tests where instead of increasingly getting closer and closer to solid white, that it just gets the background is medium gray, and the letters get closer and closer to that. Because it's not necessarily that we need to distinguish between pure white and not pure white. It's more just between different shades of medium gray.
Gotcha.
That I don't know. That just seems like it kind of feels like more of a test of what we're actually doing, if that makes sense.
No, it totally does. I'm following your logic on that. Yeah, we obviously didn't think of that.
Before someone else gets the LASIK surgery, we'll come up with our own. It'll be the Ray Langenberg chart instead of the Pelly chart, and we'll test out the grayscale difference there.
Yeah, and we've been talking about the Pelly chart, but just on the regular vision chart, by the way, I can see now, without the aid of glasses, 2015 in both eyes, so even better than 2020, and one of my eyes is actually 2010. So
wow,
yeah, it's like super eagle vision. It's
like
awesome.
superhuman.
Yes, Legolas vision.
Yeah, there's some sort of your superpower will be seeing things being able to see the street sign slightly before everyone else does in the car.
Yes, that would be my mutant power.
Your mutant power. Okay, well, you mentioned to me that we had gotten some feedback, some listener mail, back from the audience out there in the interwebs. What saith the constant listener?
Yeah, it'll be easier if I just basically summarize this and give just kind of a quick synopsis. I'll just kind of hit the main points here. But
sure.
The listener had mentioned that they had listened to the podcast that had the Haber discussion, where we were discussing the Haber article. And, she was listening and she had listened to the various arguments that we had talked about. And, we, for the listeners who remember that podcast and checked it out, if you haven't, go back and check that one out. But Ralph and Lynn Haber wrote an article that essentially went through all of the various error rate studies and had criticized all the various error rate studies. And the paper basically concludes there are a number of studies that have been done. None of these studies tell us anything about error rates in casework and don't tell us anything about the application of ACE-V. Therefore, using them in court is completely pointless, does nothing or for the trier of fact, does not help determine the reliability of ACE-V, and therefore essentially nothing has been done in this area that is suitable to tell us about the reliability of ACE-V. I mean, that's a fair summary of that episode, wouldn't you say?
That's what the article from the Habers basically states.
Okay. So the listener, and I'm just sort of paraphrasing here, the listener has said, you guys addressed that and you guys sort of read points of it, but what you didn't tell the listeners was how to respond to a defense argument. Let's say defense has that article and they start reading from it. You just spent as on the stand maybe 30 minutes, maybe an hour, or as I have in some either Fry hearings or Daubert hearings, maybe spent a whole day talking about these studies. And so now defense comes back on cross-examination, pulls up this article and says, well, this article says everything you just told the court is a waste of our time, and starts running through those points. How do you respond, or what could you tell the listeners how to respond to this article, and how do you prep your listeners to defend this article if they are essentially presented with it in court? And then this listener went on to tell me about what a sexy voice I have and how I purr her to sleep. I'm just paraphrasing here. And so, something about, purring her to sleep at night and that kind of stuff. But I
I've gotten my fair share of comments about, I think the quote was my pipes. Unfortunately, it was a he that was complimenting my pipes. But
I was thinking
anyway.
Your buttery sweet pipes were right.
my deep tones.
your Barry White sexiness.
Yes, that's. I look exactly like Barry White. That's me to a T.
Oh, you are very white. I'm not sure about Barry White, but certainly very white.
Anyway, we digress.
So yes, back to the listener's comment. That I actually thought that was a really good point, because we really didn't address. All right, so what do we do here? So all right, so Eric, put yourself in that position. You've gone through this. You've run through the studies. You've talked about black box maybe, and I think that's a realistic scenario. You talk about black box in court. Talk about the error rates, the very low erroneous identification rate in that study. Out of 17,000 some decisions, there are 6 erroneous identifications in that study. And then so you've clearly made some arguments that, all right, ACE-V is pretty reliable, especially when it comes to erroneous identifications. And now defense pulls out the Haber article and says everything you just told us is utter crap. So how would you kind of respond to that?
It'll be, I think, a little bit easier. I'm going to cheat a little bit in a few weeks down the road or a few months down the road, when that article is actually, I think, more officially published. Because right now it's still in the, if I understand right, kind of just pre-published stage. It's not officially out yet. Is that right?
Well, it's published online. So,
okay.
I mean, there's for those that get the online version of the article, they can get a copy of it. So I mean, as far as we're concerned, it's published.
Right.
It's just not in print yet.
So a little cheat would be very shortly there'll be a response published from I think just about every researcher whose work the Habers criticized, and just from I just recently happened to take a class from Melissa Gish at the FBI, and she had mentioned. And I think, Glenn, you'd mentioned a little bit of this too to me, that of some of the very detailed response that the folks at Nobilis from the Black Box study are preparing in response to this article. So I think
Right.
Very shortly, the average person out there will have a huge bucket of ammunition to refute what comes out of that article. I don't know. It kind of depends on exactly which part of what they're talking about they're looking at. I mean, some of just the general inconsistencies that we spoke about. They say it's not like casework, and then they criticize others, other studies for being too much like casework, not being able to compare everything against each other versus. That not really being the point. I mean, all these different studies weren't designed to be compared against each other. They were designed to answer very specific questions, which, to greater or lesser extent, they succeeded at answering the specific questions that they were designed to address. And for the bigger ones, like the black box study or your white box study, and then also Nobilis's white box study, I think the answers are pretty clear. If you basically come down to, is an identification decision from a trained latent print examiner reliable and accurate, over and over and over again, that's very clearly demonstrated to be yes.
So you're not necessarily making the distinction that, okay, well, fine, this may not tell us too much about casework, or maybe it does, maybe it doesn't, but if the question is, can a trained fingerprint examiner reliably make and accurately make decisions using the ASB process, then these studies do tell us something.
Yeah, well, and yes, and also it would also depend on the person that's being questioned on the stand. I would personally, make the link between some of these specific studies and myself doing casework because I participated in these studies.
Oh, I hadn't thought about that.
So, yes, I would think that the results from the black box study reflect, the product of my casework because I approached the black box study very much like I do casework. And by the time I worked through that 100th comparison, it was very much like a very, just a large case. Now, I don't know what results, what the results were from my participation in the black box study, but I've also participated in other studies, like one of yours, where I do know the results, because that was designed into the study, was that the participants would be able to later on anonymously view their results just individually. And from this study that was designed to be extremely difficult with latents that were probably the most likely to produce errors, I had no errors while participating in this study. So,
okay.
I mean, that's how I would approach it, is kind of use whatever they're doing with to kind of, get around it and then go further to support what I'm saying.
Okay, all right. Fair enough. I think...
Go ahead, what about you?
Yeah, I think for me, I've already done this exercise. In fact, I did this for several days with the Habers because, I had to testify in court where they were the expert witness for defense. I was for prosecution, so I spent several days. Then he spent a day, and then I came back for rebuttal. And so I've been down this road before. And the main thing that I think I focused on is that every study has limitations. He's pointing out what he believes to be limitations of the studies. Some of them I agree with. Some of them are limitations. Some of them are not necessarily, in my view, correct. assessments. He says, for example, in like my study and in my white box and in the FBI black box, he says, for one thing, we don't know that they did ACE-V. And that's not true, because the computer forces you to do analysis, comparison, and make a decision. You can only do ACE-V. Admittedly, in like, for example, my black box, it is true. I mean, the examiners were basically told, just do this as you would do casework. So I don't know that every examiner sat and did a full analysis first and then a comparison. They could have started with analysis and comparison together. They basically were told, do this as you would in casework. So there was no way to monitor, what the various steps were, because they, and even in that study, didn't have to necessarily document a separate analysis and comparison and chart things out. It was more of a quick and dirty kind of black box approach, but that was the point of the study. So yeah, I mean, all these studies have limitations, but I don't necessarily think it draws from the overall theme that shows up in all the studies. And I think that's what we talked about in the episode, is that in a meta study, if one was to do a meta study on these articles, you could easily draw out some themes. Yeah, they all vary a little bit in their application and their design, but there are still common themes. The erroneous exclusion rate is always higher than the erroneous identification rate. The inconclusives, there are more inconclusives when they're coming from the same source than when they're coming from different sources, showing a disparity in decision making. Things like that. There's more variability when you start getting towards no value decision and inconclusive decisions than really easy, straightforward identification decisions. So again, to the Habers, they pointed to their criticisms, but it's really just one guy, one man who has these criticisms, and I don't know that a lot of the other critics share all of his criticisms. We haven't heard an outcry from the critical community on the black box study, the FBI black box study, whereas we did hear an outcry from the community on the FBI 50K versus 50K study. I mean, there were a number of people that sounded off on that. On the black box, we just have the Habers. We haven't heard Cole or Stoney or, Sachs, Kohler, and others who had some invested interest in error rates. They haven't sounded off. That doesn't mean that they fully support them or don't have some minor criticisms, but we have not heard from them in the same way that we had in other instances. So I look at it as just basically one man's viewpoint, and some of his viewpoints are a bit extreme, even, I think, for critics.
Well, hopefully that answers the question of how to respond. But I think, overall, I mean, it depends on the questions that come out from the Haber's article and their criticism. But the big one that comes across to me from their article is that you for a variety of reasons you can't compare all these studies against each other, and I don't know, that comes across to me as false, just because I don't know, it just doesn't seem like anyone's actually trying to do that. They're setting up a straw man to knock down and then falsify all of these studies because you can't compare them. Well, no one's actually trying to. It's more just looking at these general trends, looking at like I was saying, the specific questions that each study is trying to answer, and adding to the general knowledge through the work of each of these things, which taken individually helps demonstrate the overall accuracy of the discipline.
Yeah, I think you kind of hit the nail on the head, that if I knew that defense was basically citing this article, and maybe it was in their, let's say it's in their defense brief or whatever, or they've hired the Habers in the case, because then you're going to get this, all these arguments anyway. I think what I would do is I would still submit all the error rate articles that I would have anyway. So those should be submitted, to the court, and I would attach any of the responses that come in Science and Justice from either myself or from the FBI or other any of the other researcher groups. I would attach those, be prepared to discuss and rebut those, And at the end of the day, I mean, it's going to be the court deciding anyway. Have you shown that this meets some minimum criteria for the courtroom? And I would imagine most courts are going to not, are going to look at this and go, okay, well, there's a lot of research done. Okay, there is a critic here. There's a response to it. And I think, at the end, it's probably not going to have that big of an effect. But I think submitting all those articles along with those rebuttals and responses, I think, would be helpful.
All right, perfect. Do we have any other mail that's come in, or any other things we need to address before jumping into our main topic of the week?
I actually spoke to one of the this committee, the commission that's being formed, the National Commission on Forensic Science.
Right.
Yeah, I spoke to one of the newly appointed commission members, and this person, I won't say their name yet because I don't know if this person anticipated I would be talking about them on a podcast. But this person said that they're heading out to Washington next week, and so when listeners hearing this, they'll be in Washington going through this. And the commission member has no idea what's going on. They have no idea what this commission's going to do, but this person's excited to get involved, excited to find out what their charge is going to be, is honored to be on the commission, hopes to make a difference, seems very, motivated to get involved, but also sort of agreed with me that doesn't believe that at this level they're going to be making policy decisions, that their commission will be overseeing things and will probably be the people who are generating ideas to find money, talking to people in Washington, raising awareness, and putting together, subcommittees and things like that to actually do the hands-on kind of work. So kind of an oversight commission, if anything.
Oh, good to know that's the general feeling, at least from this one individual, of where this commission's going. But also good to know that nothing's drastically changed in Washington, and still nobody knows what's going on, and we'll just kind of figure it out as they go along.
Yeah, and still, though, I mean, I still feel the same way. I mean, even talking to this individual, that, they're going to be making policy decisions on forensic science, and this person was calling me for forensic science questions, rather simple forensic science questions that forensic scientists can answer. So, on the one hand, I love the motivation, and I hope, as a stakeholder in the broader sense, they're going to be able to bring something to the table. But, on the other hand, that's why I'm talking to this person, because they had a relatively simple forensic science question that they couldn't answer. And I went, okay, on the... This is, I'm back to my original concern. So I guess what the person said to me, and I completely agree, their sense is that the entire community of stakeholders is holding their breath and waiting to see what they're going to do and what's going to happen. I think that's the fairest thing.
Right.
That's probably a very fair assessment. We are just holding our breath and waiting to see.
But there is this nervousness of, like you're saying, people not really knowing, in charge of making decisions at a level that could have pretty drastic effects.
Right. So, I guess we'll just wait and see what happens.
All right. Well, we'll hopefully find someone to get on the podcast after that goes through, and they publish whatever comes out through that commission that they're meeting here very shortly. Obviously, have even more discussion about what they've written up, what they've decided, and what's more to come. Well, we're about halfway through the show. Why don't we take a quick break, and we'll be back here in just a minute to finish out the rest of the show. We'll be right back. Hey everybody. Latent print examiners listening now are very familiar with terms like analysis, evaluation, sufficiency, verification, and error. Exclusionology, Standards in Reducing Errors, is a new class from Eric Ray and Penny Decant that examines all of those terms as applied to the exclusion decision. If you're interested in bringing this 3-day class to your area or attending the next class, contact me at eric@rayforensics.com. More information is also available at eliteforensicservices.com. Now back to the show. All right, and we're back. Thank you guys for sticking with us. And now we're going to jump into a new article from Simon Cole. So it's going to be coming out here shortly in Law, Probability, and Risk. And it's called Individualization is Dead. Long Live Individualization. Reforms of Reporting Practices for Fingerprint Analysis in the United States. And what he's basically referring to is, he kind of talks about a little bit later on, this idea of the king is dead, long live the king. So in France, as soon as the old king dies, there's instantly a new king. And you acknowledge that the king is dead, but you then instantly say, long live the king. And what he's getting at here...
And essentially... Oh, yeah, sorry. I'm
no,
stepping
go ahead.
on your feet already. No, you're right. You're going to say it.
Exactly. And so he's essentially equating that to saying that, okay, everyone's, now back like in 2009, these things came out saying don't say individualization anymore, don't say to the exclusion of all others, don't say 100% certain, don't say 0% error rate, but we're all still basically saying that anyway, even to this day. And I guess in the broadest sense, he is right on certain occasions. As these semantic issues of wording and definition has evolved over the past, let's say, 5 years since the NAS report, the decision threshold of where I make the call to say it's him hasn't changed. The only thing that's really changed is how that's being described, or the wording, the semantics behind all of that. So I would agree with him, again, in broad strokes at that level. But he goes a little bit further, and we'll get into this here. So what he outlines is 3 big events when things have changed recently in this term individualization. The first being the NAS report coming out. The second being a modification to a SWIG-FAST definition of individualization in 2009, and the last being another modification in 2011. So that's kind of overall, the whole article. But Glenn, I know you were greatly involved in those modifications on SWIG-FAST at those meetings, and then throughout the article, Cole quotes from transcripts of court that involved yourself and your coworkers up in Minnesota. So I know that you have plenty you want to say about this. So let me kind of turn things over to you a little bit and see which direction you want to go first.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I mean, your assessment of the article, I agree with too. That I actually quite like the title. I mean, the title has captured it very nicely. Individualization is dead. Long live individualization. As you said, it's referring to the king is dead. Long live the king, meaning that a new king is put in place, but the especially from the French, the regime has not changed at all. There's still a monarchy. It's still the same regime. You've just put a new figurehead in place, but nothing has really changed. And that does capture sort of what's going on here a little bit, is the words have changed. Identification, individualization, a different type of individualization, back to identification, then a new kind of individualization. And it's very confusing. And I am the first to step up and admit, yeah, this is confusing as hell to fingerprint people. I have to imagine someone looking from the outside with all the history has to be very confused by some of this as well. So I think what I would like to do for this is discuss some of the actual history. If you read the article, it actually gives a very good outsider's look at the events, the documentation, the sources, that anyone from the outside would be able to see these little changes, but maybe not understand what happened behind the scenes. So,
and real quick,
go ahead.
What I was kind of surprised with is that he seemed to miss the even further back, the first change in 2002, when the wording switched from identification to individualization.
Yeah,
If you read,
that's actually where I was going to start. Do you know that story? Why that changed?
I mean, I wasn't even in the field at the time, but just my general impression is that there was this general feeling in the air that things needed to be made more scientific. I'm not sure if it came out of the first Daubert hearings, Daubert challenges, but there seemed to be this move from identification and non-identification into individualization, exclusion, and inconclusive.
Yeah, I mean, you hit it right on the head there. And they're a little more specific than that. It was one of the first Daubert challenges, but not the first. It was U.S. v. Havard, Havvard, I think. It was a Daubert hearings, in fact, in Indiana. And Steve Meagher had attended these Daubert hearings. There were several of them over a couple of days, and they were in different disciplines. There was a footwear one, there's a handwriting one, might have even been a firearms one,
right.
and then the latent print one. The latent print one was last. So Steve had the opportunity to sit through all of these Daubert hearings. And again, for the listeners that don't know, Steve Meagher was the unit chief, or one of the unit chiefs at the FBI at that time. He was, I believe, co-chair of Swigfast, and he was the Daubert guy at the FBI, and everyone knew Steve. So Steve had gone through all these hearings and had heard examiners in different disciplines talk about identifying a size 9 Nike Air Jordan class characteristics, but individualized it to the unique accidental acquired characteristics on the shoe, or identified a 9mm caliber cartridge case, but individualized it to this particular barrel to the exclusion of all others. So whenever the examiners in other fields talked about identification, it was identification of class characteristics. And whenever they were using unique, quote-unquote, characteristics, they were making individualizations to the exclusion of all others. And so when he got up there at the end and testified to an identification to this person, to the exclusion of all others, he was concerned that it wasn't in line with what other disciplines were doing, and that the word identification was essentially selling us short. So he came back to Swigfast around that time, which was 2002, and proposed that Swigfast change to individualization, and that the community get behind to the exclusion of all others, and so that was put into that definition, as you pointed out. And I remember that first IAI where he proposed it to the IAI, because the IAI would always go through Swigfast changes. And I remember the community going, well, we get behind the idea of it. Okay, I mean, fine, to the exclusion of all others, but this word is hard to say. It doesn't make a great verb if you identify something versus individualize something. It doesn't flow off the tongue very nicely in English. And a lot of people avoided it just because they felt it was just semantics, as the article points out a little bit. So you're right on with that.
And our agency was very much like that. We never went to that term in reports or in testimony.
Yeah, it's not easy to say in court if you're talking about individualization or individualizing someone. That's a lot of syllables, and they're not. It does not flow nicely. But the concept was still there. That it was really to emphasize, and it did come along the heels with Ashbaugh's book, which was published in '99, the Quantitative Qualitative Friction Ridge Analysis, that really espoused, of course, individualization to the exclusion of all others. So, I mean, there was this movement here at that time. Okay, so the Cole article captures that, but maybe doesn't quite have the history, and certainly couldn't have known that it was coming from this Havard case, but does capture these changes. All right, so then the next thing you pointed out was that this was on the books for a long time until the NAS report came out. And that's true. It was after the NAS report that now Swigfast removes to the exclusion of all others. The Cole article, refers to it as the 6 little words. And those 6 little words are very, very important. In Cole's view, did you get this from the article? In Cole's view, he sees it as semantics, that whether or not you say the six little words or not to the exclusion of all others, it doesn't matter. When you say, I believe this person is the source, whether or not you say those six little words or not, you are certainly implying those six little words, and you're certainly telling lay people and jurors and judges, I am saying it's his print, and I don't think it's anyone else's print. And did you get that sense too?
Oh, absolutely. And it seemed as the wording evolved over time that in Cole's view that any change in the wording of this kind of definition doesn't matter. It's all the same thing. It's all saying to the exclusion of all others, just getting down to this one guy. And he even states towards the beginning that this concept of individualizing, getting it down to the unknown, whatever it is, from fingerprints to paint chips, the unknown thing being reduced to the possibility of only being from one possible source, is the entire framework of forensics. And then, basically spends the rest of the article trying to kind of, to kill that concept that this is an unscientific concept to get to. And again, I don't know if this may be similar to the Habers. I saw it again as a little bit of setting up a straw man of that forensic science, in my view, isn't about this. Isn't about the individualizing down to this single source. But he cites a number of places where he gets this idea from of this is what forensics is about.
Well, he gets it from Kirk, and he gets it from Kwan and a few others, and Paul Kirk stuff. Certainly, Paul Kirk called it, forensic science, the science of identification, essentially. So I can see where he would get that from, whether or not that's our general feeling today, but I could see where he'd get it, no doubt, reading Kirk's work.
And so weird, though, and I think it's a slight misquote that he put in here, is that from the NAS report, this is from, again, Cole saying this, that here, let me read it, that claims of individualization were not supported for any forensic discipline save one, nuclear DNA analysis. And I know the NAS report repeatedly says things like, that there's not research to support these decisions save nuclear DNA analysis, and they go through that quite a few times. But it seems to be a kind of misquote to say that nuclear DNA analysis is the only discipline that can reach individualizations, because they don't try to. Right,
yeah, you're absolutely right. They were reporting things in terms of statistics that, again, here are some semantics. When you're saying that you wouldn't expect to see a profile in the world population, have you not just semantically individualized someone?
And that's true. That's a kind of layperson's misunderstanding of statistics works, but that is how juries would hear that information.
Right. Yeah, I do agree with him in the sense that there are lots of semantics, and at the end of the day, whether or not you're using statistics like DNA or using an opinion, subjective probabilities in a sense, an opinion of the fingerprint examiner, you're still basically telling someone you believe these came from the same source. However you're doing it some way, and you're trying to tell someone these have come from the same source, and the chance that they've come from something else is relatively small. So small that it's really not practical to think about. But that's what we're trying to, in some way, convey, either through numbers like DNA or through through the wordplay that fingerprint examiners and firearms examiners and other disciplines try to juggle. So anyway, so going on towards the NAS report coming out in 2009, there was this change then in SWIGFAST right after that. But what's missing from this, and the article obviously wouldn't know this, but the article talks about testimony, and it talks about testimony in 2008 in a Minnesota case, the Hull case, Hull, Minnesota v. Hull. And I testified in that, Cedric Newman testified in that, and Josh Bergeron testified in that. And it was Josh's case. It was a homicide case that he was testifying in a Fry Mack hearing and ultimately the trial. And the question came up. It came up in court whether or not, because his report said that he identified, I don't know what it was, like 10 different prints to the defendant Hull in the case. And he identified all these prints, and the defense attorney had asked him, and Simon Cole was there, and Simon Cole was the defense expert, and Josh was asked, did you individualize these to the exclusion of all others? And Josh's answer was, no, I didn't. I identified them. I believe this person is the source, but I didn't compare against everyone on the planet, and so I can't exclude everyone on the planet, and I can't exclude some remote theoretical possibility that someone else out there could also have similar arrangements that could make a latent print that I couldn't distinguish from this or share these characteristics, but I'm not considering those. In my decision, I'm considering that Hull is the source of these latent prints. He didn't quite say it that clearly, but that's essentially what he was saying. And a couple of things that came out in that case that a lot of people would not know. The first is, Cedric and I were in the audience, and we had no idea Josh was going to say that. A lot of people thought we went into the Hull case to make a statement, and here we're going to stand our ground. We had no idea this was coming. I had no idea that Josh was going to... And when he said that, I looked over at Cedric and went, holy okay, well... I guess cat's out of the bag on this one, because I had felt that way, but Josh and I had never talked about it. I knew Cedric definitely felt that way. And so when we heard Josh kind of reach that on his own, I don't know, somehow he had reached this internally, and when he was asked that, he answered honestly, but what he had never done before, which was different than Cedric and I, is he had never practiced his answer. He just said what he was thinking at that time, which is very Josh, if anyone knew Josh. So he said what he was thinking and had never really practiced an answer. It didn't come out very clearly, whereas I had been practicing it for several years in my head, wondering if I would ever be asked this in court and how I would deal with this. So ultimately, when Cedric and I took the stand, we were asked those same questions, and we essentially supported Josh's statements. So that's why Cole basically talks about Cedric and mine, Josh's testimony. But it wasn't planned. It wasn't, from Josh's perspective, it wasn't in any way practiced. But we're all on the same page that you couldn't individualized to the exclusion of all others, that it was just this unattainable thing, that it would be a better approach to simply say, in your opinion, you believe this person is the source, and you're considering a more relevant population, people in, donors in the United States, donors in Minnesota, whatever you want to make that population be, but not the entire world. Okay.
And let me stop you there, because Cole goes into those exact 3 points. Mm-hmm. He discusses this idea of a theoretical possibility, this theoretical probability.
Yeah.
That it's theoretically possible, but maybe you wouldn't expect it. And then also going through and saying, I haven't compared everybody else. I can't say to the exclusion of all others because I haven't compared all others. And then this other concept of considering this local population of people in Minnesota or people in Minneapolis or whatever local population you want to address. And he pretty clearly thinks that going through and explaining these parts of the identification decision is again all just semantics, and dismisses all of these explanations as just being another way of saying individualization.
Yeah, I mean, you bring up a really good point that's what the article discusses, is that it is all semantics, that at the end of the day, whether or not you add those 6 little words to the exclusion of all others, it doesn't really seem to matter. You're still trying to point to one person and say, in my opinion, this person is the source. And I agree with Cole on that issue. The difference is, and what Cole does not discuss in the article, is that when you say the 6 little words to the exclusion of all others, it's unprovable. And we don't have any studies that support that. And that's always the distinction that I've made, and why I stopped saying it is because we don't have a study that says to the exclusion of all others, and there never will be a study on that. We do, however, have studies, particularly Cedric Newman's study, that was in the Royal Statistical Society Journal. And that study does say, what I prefer is that the more features you have in agreement, the increasingly less likely it is to find someone else by random chance that will share those characteristics. So to say that I believe this person is a source and it's unlikely someone else will share those features, or I wouldn't expect someone else to share those features by random chance, there is a study that you can cite on that. And that's the distinction for me, is that one has a research study or studies behind it, and one does not.
All right, well, everybody, I'm jumping in here to pause our discussion on the new Simon Cole article. You'll be able to hear the rest of the discussion that Glenn and I had on this next week. We just went on for too long to fit it all into one episode.
You couldn't shut me up.
We just have so much to share and to throw out there and to laugh about that we wanted to keep going for another week. But a couple things coming up here soon that we wanted to mention. Glenn, Penny and I, I'm not sure if I told you yet, we're going to be going to Riverside, California for the California division of the IAI. And we're going to be doing our exclusion workshop, the 4-hour version out there. So if anyone is in the Southern California area or wants to go out to Southern California, that's going to be the week starting April 28th.
Yes, and I have, along that line, I have a class I've talked about a couple of times, class coming up in Vegas March 3rd through the 7th, and that's going to be the Advanced ACE-V Applications for Friction Ridge Examiners course. It's a 40-hour course that deals with sufficiency, distortion, the standards for conclusions, error rates. We look at essentially the entire ACE-V process, deconstruct it, and look at all the various aspects of analysis, comparison, evaluation, and verification. And I teach that class solo, and if anyone's interested in attending that class, go to ronsmithandassociates.com and click on their training program, and you will find the Advanced ACE-V Applications course. And that should be a fun class. A couple of seats left. I would highly encourage you to come out to fabulous Las Vegas.
So if you guys have any questions about us on upcoming courses or on the show in general, have any questions you want to send us, please send that in to Glenn at eliteforensicservices.com or to Eric at rayforensics.com, and we will make sure to include it in the show. But for now, we'll be signing off and continuing everything else next week. Check for us Tuesday mornings on iTunes, on Stitcher, or on SoundCloud. But until next week, we will talk to you then, and have a great week.
Bye, everybody. Be sure to check out EliteForensicServices.com for upcoming training courses. We have great workshops and courses such as Advanced ACE-V Applications and Reducing Erroneous Exclusions. Go to www.EliteForensicServices.com today.
Music provided on this podcast by Mevio's Music Alley. Check it out at music.mevio.com.